Hi guys, my name is Avery Herring, and I am going to be presenting on the play Trifles by Susan Glaspell. First, I have three questions to think on as I present, and I will address them. The first question is, why did Susan Glaspell choose the title Trifles? Does it symbolize anything? The second, of what significance does the men mocking/laughing at the women have on the murder case? And the third question, how were women depicted and portrayed throughout the play? Is there something bigger Susan Glaspell is trying to draw attention to with it? I have four main topics to discuss throughout my presentation. The first topic is women's inequality. The second topic is relationships/loyalty. The third topic is how were women treated in the late 1800s to early 1900s. And the fourth topic is oppression. I have a few basics to understand as we go. I wanted to take a quick minute and go over them before we take a deep dive into the discussion. The first thing is, what even are trifles? Trifles are defined by the Merriam-Webster dictionary as a thing of little value, substance, or importance. Minnie has three trifles of her life in the story. The three of them are the jar of preserves, the bird cage and the bird, and the quilt. All of these were critical to the murder, but they were dismissed. Why is the title of this play Trifles? I think Susan Glaspell chose this title because it directly speaks to the fact that men during this time period may overlook critical details because they categorize them as, in quotes, dumb things women think are important. If we take a minute to think on if the roles were kind of reversed, if these were trifles in a man's life, would they have been looked at differently or with more respect as minis, or would it have been the same? My guess is during this time period, I think it probably would have mattered because they were all critical in the murder. But I think that's exactly the point that Glaspell is trying to make here. I have two quotes from the play that set the tone for today's topics, both of which were said by George Henderson, the county attorney in Trifles. The first says, "I wouldn't say she had the homemaking instinct." And the second is, "Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies?" I mean, I think we kind of get what Susan Glaspell was trying to do. They're both going to be building on the point that women were looked at in a certain way during this time, and that's what I'm going to discuss. Susan Glaspell, her timeline significance is very important because Susan Glaspell, okay, well, we'll start with when she was born. She was born July 1st, 1876. She died on July 27th, 1948, and Trifles was published in 1916. The women's suffrage time period goes all the way from the 1840s to the 1920s. So Susan Glaspell's life directly aligned during the time of the women's suffrage movement when a lot of this stuff was being brought up, awareness brought to it, attention. So I think that is very important in the way that she chose to write this story. And here I have a picture of Susan Glaspell, and underneath is my citation for where I found the image. The time period. So the 1840s to the 1920s, they were a time when women were seen solely as homemakers, housekeepers, mothers, and the husband's wife. Like I said before, Trifles was written during the time of women's suffrage, and women were beginning to stand up and come together for their social injustices, inequalities, all things of that sort. And just like in the story with Mr. Hale, Mr. Peters, the county attorney, men had most, if not all, of the power during this time period. But that goes not only within the law, but also socially and within their homes. And I think that this concept lays a foundation to the major theme of Trifles, where women were mocked and not taken seriously. Here are four examples of them being mocked, like I said on the last slide. Just kind of building on that. The first one says, I didn't know what his wife wanted made much difference. Mr. Hale said that. Mr. Peters said they wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it. And it was kind of, the sentence itself isn't really, degrading, but it's the way it was said in the play. And then after the sentence, the men laughed. So it builds there. The other one Sheriff Peters said was held for murder and worried about her preserves. Again, writing off her life trifles as something unimportant. And then Miss Peters herself, she even acknowledges, she says he'll make fun of her for saying she didn't wake up. And that there is just her saying, basically, she knows that women aren't respected very well, and they probably would be made fun of if she said something like that. So yeah, the women were not oblivious to this. They knew what was going on as well. Loyalty. Loyalty is a big theme here, and it's kind of hidden, symbolized in a way. I think it wasn't outright one of the main themes, but it is there. At the end of the story, the Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters stand together. I think this is driven from continuous lack of respect that the women felt, and it drove them to be more loyal to each other in the male-dominated society versus more loyal to the law, or in this case, like in quotations, what was right. This quote is the point where that becomes evident. Mrs. Hale snatches the box and puts it in the pocket of her big coat. This was when she was hiding the bird in the box. And this was the lady's silent agreement to hide the evidence of the bird being strangled to help Minnie's case with the murder trial. Because if it would have went to trial, that would have helped lead to Minnie's guilty verdict. Them standing together at the end was also, it was what women were doing during the time period outside of a play. Women were standing together in the 18 and 1900s to make a difference. And I think Susan Glaspell was tying that in here with them choosing to be loyal to each other and to Minnie at the same time. Throughout this story, Mrs. Hale talks about how Minnie's light burned out. How she used to be happy and joyful as Minnie Foster, but then as she turned into Minnie Wright when she married John, things changed. These are four quotes I had. The first one, she used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the girls singing in the choir. The second, she was kind of like a bird herself, real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. And this third one is a big deal because it brings home the whole idea of the story. Wright wouldn't like the bird, a thing that sang. She used to sing and he killed that too. It's showing and building on the fact that women were degraded and even put down in their own homes. This wasn't just something that occurred socially or with the law. And I think that's why Glaspell decided to depict the murder in this way. She took the bird's death as a sign of Wright taking away Minnie's joy of life. And that was her symbolism through that fact. And her, well, I say her, we don't know, but the way John was murdered lines up to be very correlative. Mina Loy, I think she's someone that I made a connection with as I read Trifles and reflecting back on week 1 with the Modernist Manifestos. Mina Loy was the Modernist Manifestos author who fought for feminism and spoke on the women's rights, more specifically during the Modernist movement. She wrote the Feminist Manifestos. She was expressing her frustration with women's inferior treatment, and in her manifesto, she was talking about sexual expression, but I do think that these ideals can be carried over to women's rights in general, just in a more broad aspect. Um, and after reading Trifles and understanding Susan Glaspell's viewpoint on women's equality, I assumed that she would mirror her beliefs with Mina Loy's. And wrapping it up, big points of the discussion. Susan Glaspell wrote Trifles about a murder, but as I talked about in my presentation, she was subtly referring to bigger things happening in the world. She did it in a way that wasn't outright and obvious. It plays entertainment, and lots of people are going to be drawn to that, go see it. And perhaps the attention it got would have been different if she hadn't wrote the play the way she did. Symbolism was used everywhere in this play. Right from the start, as I said, with the title, the way the bird was murdered, the way John was murdered, and the dialogue choices that Glaspell used when the characters were communicating with each other also builds on this. Everything that was said, I think, meant a little bit more. It made the reader think, which is a huge idea in the modernist time period with these authors. Again, she was addressing how women were treated and how it impacted them, drove them to loyalty within, the social injustices, and the main idea of this whole play was that the men didn't notice the importance of the trifles of Minnie Foster's life. And had they noticed, then things would have turned out a lot differently. And I think Susan Glaspell was really making a bigger point here than just talking about a murder. She was talking about worldly issues and bringing that all to light and some awareness to the topic. These are my works cited. I use the textbook and 4 sources. And then thank you guys for listening. And this is where I got my slideshow theme from.